In the time available, I want to just deal with some of the big issues to do with the limits of urbanization and come back to the question that you have asked in this conference. What is the world we want to live in? And that world is really summarized by this image. It could be in many places. It happens to be Mexico City. This is the image that Dan Sujic and I, in the book called The Endless City, refer to. It's a city which has literally no limits. The world is becoming more and more urban. And Professor Musa was talking about that the definition of what cities are needs to be, in a way, revised and changed. And it's the right moment and time to actually do that. Because only 2 or 3 years ago, the United Nations confirmed that we are at the tipping point. Half the world's population is now living in some form of city or another. Just think that 100 years ago, the beginning of the 20th century, it was only 10%. It's a massive change, and if things continue, we are likely to be 75% of the world living in urban conditions. And what interests me in that bottom part of the image that you see there is what is the spatial and social and economic and cultural situation of living on the left-hand side. What is that going to be like, and who of us are going to be involved in doing that? This has to be framed by probably a bigger and a global understanding, which is encouraged very much by the interdisciplinary nature of this conference. Cities are just not objects, as Professor Musa has said. Cities are where today 33% of people without water, without sanitation, without basic normal infrastructure that we take completely for granted, not just in the West but elsewhere, are living. And if that number is to include, we're talking about hundreds of millions, if not billions, in the next 20 years. What are we going to do about that? That is not the world we want to live in. And the other thing which I think we don't think about is that cities, because they contain buildings, and buildings consume energy, lighting, air conditioning, and everything else, buildings themselves consume 50% of world energy, 50%. Cars and other forms of traffic and transportation consume 25%. So 75% of world energy is used by cities, and therefore 75% of CO2 emissions in the world are produced by cities. So in terms of the challenges of this conference, in terms of the discussion with you, a small change in the organization of cities can make a massive change in terms of the health of the planet. And this is not just a question for the comfort of the West or the global North. This image shows you where people are living today. The dense white dots show where more and more people are living today. This is not an invention. This is exactly what is happening. And you can see that in India and China is where there is the greatest density of human habitation. This map, which you can't see well from where you're sitting, just shows in the whiter parts of these circles where there is going to be urbanization and higher urbanization rates in the next 10 to 20 years. All you need to think about is that every minute that I speak, roughly every minute and 20 seconds, one new person is moving into Dhaka, Lagos, and many of the Indian cities. That's one every minute. So the rate of change is what is new, not just the numbers. So how we deal with that in terms of all the globalization issues needs to be understood. But perhaps this image of Caracas in Venezuela summarizes the urban condition. What you see on the right-hand side is basically what a lot of people at this table do. We try and design buildings, try and organize cities, and on the whole, most people, not the people at this table, do it very badly. Most newly planned things in the last 50, 60 years are terrible. And I think if you go to this environment, it's absolutely standard. They work for clients who have very limited interest to what happens to the public realm. And I think the public realm of the city is what we need to pay attention to. Closer to the right, you see what transport planners do, other people who shape the future of cities. And they are about what? They're about taking people from A to B. I hear that in Prague, there's a great interest now in creating new motorways, new elevated motorways, which in 30 or 40 cities around the world we spent billions getting rid of after years of sort of change. Yes, they do take you from A to B, but they don't take you from C to D, and what they cause is severance amongst communities. Most importantly in this slide is what happens on the left. This is what is happening in most urbanized conditions in the world. It's what people do. You have planners, you have architects, and you have what people do. This is the largest informal settlement in South America called Petare, which when I took that picture had 1 million people. Moving to São Paulo, not very far in Brazil, you actually see what this change is. This is what Professor Musa has just talked about. It's not just architecture, it's not just stone and concrete. On the left you have the favela of Paraisópolis, a place where people have been living, have their own dynamic, but it has very little water, very little infrastructure. Very poor, but it works, it's where people live. On the right-hand side, there's a new development, and I don't know whether you can see it from the back of the room, but the people are so wealthy that they have swimming pools on each terrace. Now, this is not a critique of capitalism, it's just an awareness that if you make cities like this, you will not be able to walk through them and have the sort of experience that we've been talking about today. What Richard Sennett, who I know spoke yesterday, writes very eloquently about, the public realm of the city is something that really needs to be paid attention, and I stress that. And this view of Mexico City, taken about 4 or 5 years ago, which if I took this picture again today, none of that green realm would be there because the city is expanding still today, just reminds us of two things. That statistic of 75% of cities contributing to CO2 emissions. Because as the cities expand, and this is critical, you need to get from one place to another basically by car. There's hardly any other way of doing that. So the amount of traffic generated by sprawling cities is enormous. And in a place like São Paulo, for example, 1,000 cars a day are now actually being bought by people who can afford to. But think of the social costs. In Bangkok, let alone in Mexico City, and even in São Paulo, people spend something like 4 hours a day commuting. 4 hours a day commuting. In Bangkok, they actually put children at 5 o'clock in the morning in their pajamas in the back of a car to take them to school so they can sleep 2 more hours and have breakfast on the way and have dinner on the way back. What does that do to the relationships between human beings, between families, and between what sort of social citizens they're going to be? So there's a connection between design and the environment and society, and I think that is a key issue. So what is actually happening in the cities and why, and I'll speak a little bit and you'll get depressed with me and others about what's happening, but then turn quickly to positive models of change, which I think are actually driving city change, both from the bottom up and the top down. This is a typical view of a Chinese city, of a Chinese urban environment. China is going to urbanize at a grandly rapid rate, and the issue is this one. There is overcrowding and poor conditions. People live here without running water, without the basic requirements. It's a country that, as you know well, is improving enormously in terms of the economic potential of people living there. So more housing is being built where people can have a fridge, can have air conditioning, and can have all the mod cons we need to sustain modern life. This is where they're living. This is not an exaggeration as a picture. The more we travel, Dan and I, with our group at the Urban Age, this is what we see. And in terms of the issue of inflexibility to do with social conditions, I think this is absolutely essential. A city like Shanghai, which has gone from 120 buildings over 8 stories high in 25 years to over 10,000. What is the architectural response to this? This is the underbelly, in a way, that you need to make cities work. Again, a picture of Shanghai today, it could be elsewhere. But why is it that in the middle of Shanghai, a city of basically 14 million people with 9 million bicycles, it's part of the culture of the place, why is it that now cycles are no longer allowed on certain streets? Well, the issue is, I have another 12 minutes, yes? Is that right? No.
4 minutes.
No, I don't think so. Anyway, don't I have 20 minutes? No, otherwise I can stop in 5, that's right. But why is it that cycles are not allowed in the center? Because they cause congestion. To who do they cause congestion? To the cars. So there are sort of issues about the culture of how cities are run and managed. In Mumbai, when people are moved from these areas in the middle of the city, in the slums, they go and live in environments like this, funded by the World Bank and other very worthy institutions, which look like this. Now, this looks like an image from maybe 30, 40 years ago. This was built 3 years ago by a young architect, and the people who've moved in here don't have the money to actually pay for the electricity to use the lifts, So they put their rubbish in it, infested by rats. This becomes a vertical slum in 3 years rather than a horizontal one. So the question becomes, again, in terms of where we want to live, is how do you deal not just with the planning, but also the informal side of the city, which we actually don't control. This young guy moves into Mexico City to sell peanuts or cigarettes because he makes more money than he can in the fields. And that's exactly the same issue that drives people coming into the center of London to work, but also creates cities, endless cities, limits of urbanization, which you see here, and we've talked about before. In terms of what's happening, in terms of the dynamics of cities, I think probably cities in Africa today are the ones which cause perhaps most concern to people like us who are studying them. Johannesburg has become, over the years, so violent that no longer people live in the city center. It's actually been abandoned. Everyone lives behind walls. This is a typical view of what Johannesburg actually feels like today. What will happen when society sort of picks up? I think it will not become the sort of equitable environment that we actually think. And in fact, in India, where there's very little violence, Istanbul, what you're getting is a proliferation of these gated communities for different elites, usually wealthy ones or usually very poor ones, who live separate from each other. It's exactly what Richard Burdett was talking about yesterday when he was talking about borders and boundaries. It's not just their problem, it's our problem. In Paris, in Lyon, and Marseille, the fringes of the city, not unlike Prague, is where certain people of a certain caste and a certain religious background, in the case of Paris, have been living. And this is why a number of urban sociologists have been very clear that the riots which have been there over the last 6 or 7 years are related to the sort of physical planning and the social procurement. But let's look at the positive examples as I come to the final 5 minutes. Thank you. Bogota, a city of 7.5 million people, exactly the same size as London, enormous problems, not only of poverty, but also of violence due to the drugs trade and everything else. Here, a series of mayors over the last years came up with a very, very simple idea of how to basically democratize and sustain the way this city is able to grow. It's a city not unlike Mexico or São Paulo, which has hundreds of thousands of people moving in illegally and informally over time. This is one of the typical favelas or barrios, as you call them there. What happened here was that the mayors decided to build these cycleways, 85 kilometers of cycleways, into the middle of absolutely nowhere when I saw them. Over time, the favelas have grown informally, but they've grown around these cycle routes, public spaces, good schools, and libraries. So the poorest people are next to the most important pieces of social provision. This is a challenge, I think, for the design community and the politicians who deal with these issues. In addition, for example, these highly polluting and corrupted system of buses, minivans, as you see on the right, absolutely typical in the third world, were replaced by this metro bus system here on the left, which has a dedicated way on the motorways, on the inner city motorways. Now, you might think this is a technical issue. It's not. It's a profoundly social one, because what this means, and it makes the mayor, the then mayor of Bogotá, Enrique Peñalosa, laugh with happiness, is that the rich people take more time than the poor people on the bus to get to work. So what I've been talking about, and I conclude with the last 2 slides, is that we're living now, whether we like it or not, in an environment which is more and more urban, and these cities are becoming increasingly socially divided. They're becoming more and more irresponsible environmentally, and I think I have to say more undemocratically governed. And I think the opposite is clear, and I think the conclusions, certainly from my point of view, and the challenge to my colleagues at the panel, is that we can, through following some of the examples we've been showing you, create cities which are more socially cohesive, more environmentally responsible, and certainly democratically governed. And I think that's how we get to the sort of cities which are better designed. Thank you very much.